after all that we've been through. Still believe in magic. Well, yes, I do. Well, yes, I do. Well, yes, I do. Well, yes, I do. Of course I do. How long before I get in? Before it starts, before I begin? How long before you decide? But before I know what it feels like? Where to? Where do I go? If you never try, then you'll never know. How long do I have to climb up on the side?
Hello, testing, wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Thank you for all being here today for this session titled Triple Impact Nature-Based Solutions in Asia Pacific. My name is Sakina Joseph, Water Lead for the Climate Champions team, and I'll be your moderator for the day. At the COP21 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris, governments agreed that mobilizing stronger and more ambitious climate action is urgently needed to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. To connect the work of governments with many of the voluntary and collaborative actions taken by cities, regions, businesses, and investors, nations decided to appoint two UN high-level champions. The current UN climate champions for COP27 and COP28 are Dr. Mahmoud Mohaldin and Her Excellency Ms. Razan Al Mubarak. To build on the legacy of their predecessors, to engage with non-state actors and activate the ambition loop. The work is fundamentally designed to encourage a collaborative shift across all of society towards a decarbonized economy so that we can all thrive in a healthy, resilient, and zero-carbon world. To help them deliver this work, the high-level champions are supported by the Climate Champions team, a global team of experts covering a broad spectrum of fields. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Francis Way, the Executive Director of the Climate Champions team, to formally open the session. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you, Sakina. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, co-hosted by the UNFCCC, Nature for Climate, the Southeast Asia Climate and Nature-Based Solutions, or SEAN Coalition, Restore Asia, and UNEP Global Peatlands Initiative, as well as the Climate Champions team. Asia Pacific's experiencing profound and varied impacts from climate change, posing significant challenges to both the environment and human societies. Over the past 60 years, temperatures in Asia and the Pacific have increased faster than the global mean. 6 of the top 10 countries most affected by disasters are in the region, where food systems are disrupted, economies damaged, and societies undermined. Most countries in Asia and Pacific are insufficiently prepared to face extreme weather events and natural disasters, which are growing in intensity and frequency due in part to climate change, according to a new study by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. Addressing these challenges necessitates a comprehensive and collaborative approach involving governments, communities, businesses, and international organizations. Essential to this effort are mitigation and adaptation strategies aimed at building resilience and minimizing the impacts of climate change in the Asia-Pacific region. Nature is our life source, providing a stable climate, food, and well-being. More than $44 trillion of economic value generation, more than half of the world's total GDP, is dependent on nature. But right now, nature is not being valued. Nature-based solutions are not only necessary to help the world meet the Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees and adapt to an increasing volatile climate, but also critical to deliver on the global biodiversity framework. Nature-based solutions can reduce vulnerability to climate disasters that especially affect marginalized people while providing food security and jobs. Nature-based solutions can mitigate vulnerability to climate disasters, particularly affecting marginalized populations, while concurrently ensuring food security and job creation. Investing in nature-based solutions is pivotal to the transition to a bioeconomy that is both nature positive and net zero, a critical component for achieving the global 2030 targets. The Climate Champions team, in collaboration with partners, are championing a 2030 breakthrough, 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent mitigated per year through nature-based solutions. We're working closely with our 2 UN climate change high-level champions to help mobilize, align, and accelerate the impact of this non-state actor leadership to help deliver on the promise of Paris. To succeed, climate action must be inclusive, encompassing all parties, from the global south and north to women, youth, and indigenous peoples. Mobilizing more businesses to take nature-positive action on climate change is imperative. Combined efforts aim to amplify the significant work of various initiatives, such as the Global Peatlands Initiative, and foster more collaboration through coalitions like the Southeast Asia Climate and Nature-Based Solutions Coalition. Ultimately, the goal is to learn from each other while working together to unlock the necessary investments. The Asia-Pacific region encompasses about a quarter of the planet's investable forest carbon, nearly half of the world's blue carbon, and nearly 97% of tropical peatland carbon sinks, and is facing unprecedented demand for carbon credits, and there is an unparalleled opportunity to access and direct climate finance. The Asia-Pacific region is well positioned to be a global leader. This event stands as a catalyst for integrating nature-based solutions into both regional policies and international commitments. It seeks to present nature-based solutions as an investable economic opportunity for the Asia-Pacific region. The dialogue will be critical in discussing how the region can cooperate in its transition to bio-circular economies that are both net zero and nature positive. This event aims to stimulate new cross-sectoral collaborations and inspire policy and investment innovations, marking a pivotal moment for climate action in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. Thank you so much. Thanks for setting the scene. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the session, Diana Kuponsky, a policy program expert and coordinator for the Global Peatlands Initiative in the Biodiversity and Land Management Branch at the United Nations Environment Program. She is an expert in ecosystems and biodiversity. She delivers a suite of landscape management and climate change programs, bridging science to policy to contribute to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Dinah has worked for over 22 years on a range of issues within emergency, humanitarian, and development fields. For UNEP, she works globally and has led teams to develop and implement projects such as the Global Peatlands Initiative, UN RED Program, Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, to name a few. Thank you so much for being here today. Please, Dinah, join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Sokina. Thank you, Francis, for setting the scene. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this dynamic that I think as individuals we're all starting to feel. Communities, especially our most vulnerable, are really experiencing the climate emergency firsthand. And this is especially prominent in the Asia-Pacific region, with impacts to nature, economy, and well-being of so many. Scaling up nature-based solutions represents an opportunity, and it's also a beacon of hope for our fight against the climate change emergency, as well as other climate challenges we're facing that lead us towards a resilient and adaptive life. There's no quick fix for the climate emergency and the halting of and overexploitation of our natural resources. But if humanity protects, sustainably manages, and restores nature, it can address society's challenges. We can ensure human well-being and promote biodiversity benefits. Everything comes from nature. We are nature. Not only our food, water, air, and medicines, but every single object, every single substance we use, regardless of how much it's been processed, starts with nature and ends in our nature. So we need an urgent shift from using nature to working with nature, because we're using it up, driving nature and biodiversity to extinction, destruction, and collapse. In the last 2 decades, we've seen billions of hectares of land being degraded. Our oceans, rivers, lakes are drying up, shifting and being polluted. Our peatlands are being deforested and drained, and the list goes on. Natural capital has declined, and as a result, ecosystems and their services are increasingly under this strain, failing to protect us and failing to provide for most of us. Livelihoods, food security, and indeed the whole of the Sustainable Development Agenda are at risk, and they're suffering. If we reach the tipping point for nature, our foundation collapses, and no amount of human innovation or human technology advancements will save us. We need to rethink. We need to redesign our economies, and we need them to be nature-centered. We've seen signals from governments and the whole of society to prioritize nature-based solutions, and as a key enabler to fight the interlinked climate and nature crises and get us back on track to meet our ambitious and necessary sustainable development goals. There are signs that the world is ready to change. Last year, when all member states of the United Nations came together with and in consultation with our 9 major groups and stakeholders, they adopted a nature-based solutions resolution at the UN Environment Assembly, Nairobi, Kenya. That was the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly. And within this resolution, they agreed. They agreed that nature-based solutions are defined as actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably manage, and use natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems, the whole basket, noting that these address social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively. while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience, and biodiversity benefits. That's a mouthful, but it's all-encompassing, and it's super important because every single country in the world agreed to that, and they were really supported and engaged with all 9 major groups and stakeholders. A universal definition of the nature-based solutions may be recent, but when we study what people do already, we see that nearly 75 million people are already employed in nature-based solutions, with the majority, and that's 96%, of these people living in lower middle-income countries in Asia and the Pacific. So this is an incredible place for the entire world to look to for inspiration, for how to actually do it. You've got incredible experiences. But the majority of the global NBS expenditure occurs in high-income countries. So if investment in NBS was tripled by 2030, an additional 20 million jobs could be created worldwide. And this has been identified in UNEP's State of the Finance for Nature report as a key step to achieving biodiversity, land restoration, and climate goals set out by the United Nations. And green jobs alone won't abate the climate crisis. Greening the economy, though, in a way that's fair, inclusive, and creating work opportunities and leaving no one behind, however, will be a giant and a much-needed leap in the right direction. So by working with nature, emissions can be reduced by up to 11.7, I'm going to be accurate here, 11.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year by 2030. And that's over 40% of what we need to limit global warming. So moving to nature and recognizing the incredible urgency of decarbonization of the economy, that's not denied, but to move towards nature and recognize that it can offer the solution is what we really need. That the deep investment in technologies, we need to rethink this. Because approximately $133 billion per year currently flows into nature-based solutions. That's a lot, but not even close to what we need. Public funds make up about 86% of that, and private finance, only 14%. So there's a big gap. We need more urgent action, and we need the private sector to bring in the funds to be able to scale up nature-based solutions. This is a good investment for the private sector because the private sector relies on people. It relies on purchase power, healthy people, a working community, and a really healthy global economy. And that comes back down to who we are, and it comes back down to nature. Close to 1/3 of the GHG mitigation by 2030 can be attained through nature-based solutions. And I want to highlight one of my favorite things in the world, which are wetlands. Wetlands are ecosystems which can contribute a share of about 14% of that 40%. So they pack a punch in their tiny but mighty ecosystems. So taking into account that wetland ecosystems offer these multiple co-benefits like flood and drought mitigation, water purification and biodiversity, conservation of wetlands is an important mitigation and adaptation measure. And I want to look at the tiny but mighty peatlands. They are a wetland ecosystem, but they're very unique. And we see that the conservation and restoration of tropical peatlands alone can reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 800 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And that's close to 2% of current annual global emissions. A further 2% of annual emissions are in the other areas of the world that have degraded peatlands. So on total, peatlands cover only 3% of our land surface area. They then are degraded. There's only about 12% of them that are degraded, so that's 0.4% of our land surface area. That tiny little 0.4% of our land surface area contributes 4% at least of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that is when peatlands are not on fire. That is just emissions. So this is something that I want to just highlight as a really critical example of the triple win for the planet, for people, and for the climate. In fact, the Paris Agreement will be out of reach if we do not urgently halt and restore degraded peatlands. And we also need to, at the same time, protect the 88% of peatlands that are still healthy worldwide. Peatland sustainable management is a good example of a nature-based solution, and indeed it provides us health and safe drinking water for communities that live in and around them. It provides some flood retention. It holds and releases water, and they're incredibly important safe havens for rare, endangered, and migratory species. Such actions for peatlands, especially in Southeast Asia, would simultaneously support biodiversity health, improve water quality, reduce air pollution, and safeguard people's health and well-being, and also allow them to retain their cultural heritage and their traditional practices. So we have an incredible opportunity to safeguard our environment, to support sustainable development, especially in Southeast Asia, which is home to over 54% of the world's peatlands. Peatlands and the region of Asia-Pacific community have a major role to play, and they are playing it. So countries like Indonesia have committed to large-scale restoration and rewetting of peatlands. It's an enormous task. They're committing to 2 million hectares of peatlands being restored, and they're working hard. And they called a climate emergency in 2016 after the peatland fires, and this is how the Global Peatlands Initiative was formed, because taking the lessons from Indonesia and Southeast Asia and bringing them across to the Congo Basin, and then jumping across as well to the Andes, to Peru, and the Amazonia Basin, is how the South-South exchange, peer-to-peer learning, inspiration and policy regulation, but also ambition for action, is how we're going to make up the lost time on the Paris Agreement. But that just shows you can't do it alone, right? We need to work together. Collaborative and concerted effort, sharing these lessons, being honest and open, and basing decisions on science, and informed by all things that are ways of knowing, and valuing those ways of knowing is critical. We need to work across landscapes, across borders, across sectors, and to take a whole range of actors to activate for peatlands and for wetlands and for nature. We need additional private investment in nature-based solutions, and that should be accompanied by an investment in the monitoring, research and development, and verification. The public purse has been paying for the research and development for such a long time. We need to also understand that the private sector has a role to play in supporting the advancements. We need this now. We need this for NBS to work. So the situation in Asia Pacific demands this urgent but decisive action, and it offers hope along with a sustainable and holistic transboundary approach to address the challenges we face. We need to prioritize solutions that can provide a long-term impact for each and every one of us. So I'm really excited to hear the discussions today. I'm going to stay for a little bit longer than I had expected, and be with you. Please do interact, share your ideas, and also join that global community. Don't keep that knowledge base within the Asia and Pacific region, but leap over borders and boundaries and reach out across the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you so much for providing a deeper dive on the urgency of accelerating action and underscoring some of the key benefits of doing so. So for the next segment, we're going to have a panel discussion. So I welcome the panelists to join me on stage. So first, our panelist, I would like to first introduce our first panelist, Jeff Silverman, who is a carbon development specialist and an applied geospatial practitioner with over 20 years of experience supporting natural resource conservation programs with government, nonprofit, and private sector organizations. Over the last decade, he focused on voluntary market carbon project development and implementation. Currently, he is the Senior Director of Carbon Development for Conservation International's Asia-Pacific Field Division. In addition, he sits on the steering committee of the Southeast Asia Climate and Nature-Based Solutions Coalition, a collaboration between leading international non-governmental organizations with an established presence in Southeast Asia, which aims to accelerate and increase implementation of nature-based solutions that are considered high quality, high integrity, offering triple benefits in the region. So my first question to you, Jeff, is why the focus on the region? And in your view, what constitutes as high quality, triple benefit, nature-based solutions? Over to you.
Great, well, thank you very much for having me. Great to be here. I think it's two distinct questions. I think regionally and why that scale is both a strategic and practical reason. Is that better? Okay. It has both strategic and practical reasons for the scale of regional approach and for this coalition. Strategically, access to ASEAN bodies. There's quite a bit of policy level influence and impact that we collectively as a group can influence. And practically, the members of this coalition are conservation organizations, which are a collection of field programs throughout Asia Pacific. And these are very focused on impacts on the ground, working in projects that have spanned decades for influence and relationships with communities, local government, et cetera, necessary to make the changes discussed in the keynote. So at that regional scale, we work together collaboratively to share these experiences, scale these impacts, but keeping it always grounded on what's happening in the field in these conservation programs. And the reason for that, and when you say triple benefit, is many of these nature impacts, or most of these nature impacts from NBS are related to clear changes in our land management decisions and approaches. And to do that, that has to happen at the community level. So practically being able to address that really works on unlocking resources that's been traditionally very difficult to get on the ground in the field. This sort of long dream of payments for ecosystem services. How do we get paid to leave the tree standing rather than cut? So it's been a transformational opportunity to bring finance to the ground, to these communities, to allow them to have clear tenure, clear voice, to have their traditional land management practices understood, respected, and expanded, to provide a pushback and alternatives from more extractive uses of resources. So when you say triple benefit from a climate solution, to me, it's really the other way around. If you create healthy communities with voice and able to make strong decisions for land management based on their own local community interests and traditions, the outcome from that is the climate benefit. The outcome from that is the biodiversity benefit. So as a purchaser of a carbon credit, you're looking at it as a commodity and attaching labels such as triple bottom line and biodiversity. You're really losing the point. And the point is directing finance where it's needed in a transformational way.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Another question that I have, so what are the key components for implementing these nature-based solutions?
Well, the area that I work in is conservation focused, which is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a community focused. These are a process and a approach to conservation that has developed and grown over decades in my sector. And it is very much a situation of trust and relationships on the ground. So that is one component, is a long-term history in a landscape with the people, with the local government, and a level of trust necessary to make changes, to move away from the sense that this is a 3-year grant or a 5-year grant, and if I jump through these hoops, I'll get this small amount of money, but instead focusing on very long-term strategic changes in land use policy, rights, and methods. So that's the key, one. And second is really working on the science of restoration, the science of monitoring these key natural systems and environments. So biodiversity monitoring, so we understand the populations better, and additionally identifying those rare remaining intact areas and prioritizing preserving those because they're irrecoverable. So those are the components, is really long-term commitment, focus on the community, a strong and expansive monitoring program, and really ensuring that the overall design and structure is recognizing the landscape ecological functions and the importance of these systems and protecting those.
Thank you so much. What I'd like to understand, I think one of the biggest difficulties for implementing these projects is finance, right? So based on your experience, how have you been able to mobilize finance to scale up some of the projects that you've worked on?
Well, that's what this has been about. And so I've been in RED Plus for quite a long time, and it's been a very challenging process because the finance was not there and hadn't been there, despite our early hopes that we could identify a way to get people to pay for these ecosystem services, having the people responsible for extracting resources but not putting back into the environment. Unfortunately, that finance did not materialize, and so we have been doing traditional conservation finance for decades, and that's relying on donor bases, philanthropy, public money, development money, et cetera. So the potential of what we're facing, or the opportunity that we have now of conservation finance coming from carbon finance and private sector is quite transformational. I know personally, working on field programs, I was in Cambodia for 6 years before this, really trying to balance where money goes into to keep it on life support alive between grant cycles, et cetera. With the advent of carbon finance in just the last couple years, we are seeing a potential for regular, predictable, sustainable levels of finance, which allows for longer term planning and design. But we're just starting. This is the new opportunity. This is a new process.
Thank you so much. With that said, this is a great opportunity to segue to Jeffrey Cito, the Managing Director of New Forests Asia. He oversees the New Forest Emerging Market Nature-Based Investment Program in both Southeast Asia and Africa. He has more than 20 years of experience in financial services, principally in private equity, in the infrastructure, natural resources, and energy sectors. He's an experienced investor in the Asian region, having originated, and executed a wide range of transactions in various regulatory regimes. He has completed deals in the majority of the Southeast region and China. Outside of Asia, he's also worked in North America, Europe, and Australia. So first, I'd like to see if you'd like to comment on anything that Jeff has said in terms of financing, but also to describe the work that you do.
Yeah, so just going back to what Jeff said, I won't forget the name, but it is all about payment for ecosystem services, but also valuation of land. And there are many competing uses for land, and unfortunately the way the world values land today is what that land can produce, or basically a discounted cash flow of all the future cash flows of that land. So unfortunately, without valuation of nature through monetization of some of the ecosystem service and other things that land produces, it can't compete, so you get conversion and deforestation into palm oil and other types of land uses in agriculture. So I think that is one of the fundamental things that I think is driving the space today. For those of you who don't know who New Forest is, I'll probably give you a quick summary just to give context. It's not an ad or anything, but you know, we're the second largest NBS and forestry investment manager in the world. We manage about just over $7 billion across all our fund families, and that encompasses about 1.3 million hectares of land. That's for production, conservation, and restoration. We have offices in North America, Australia, New Zealand, which is pretty much our home base, and I manage the Southeast Asian and the Sub-Saharan African portion of our funds. We are very familiar with nature-based solutions. Ultimately, in San Francisco, where our office in North America is, we are the largest providers of carbon offsets in that compliance scheme, the ARB 32 in California. We were the first to issue Australian credits, ACCUs in Australia, and we're issuing NZUs under the New Zealand ETS scheme. And in the emerging markets, which I manage, we're looking at the voluntary carbon markets. So again, we are looking at how we can invest into the land, not just to monetize nature-based and ecosystem services, but also we actually grow trees. And fundamentally, we started out as a forestry manager. So I think when in terms of the thesis and the investment thesis in Asia, we're up to our second fund. It's Tropical Asia Forest Fund 2, and we've used a blended finance structure to be able to drive ultimately scale into the asset class. And that blended finance structure is a recognition that there are different pools of capital, and not just private and commercial pools seeking a return, but different pools of capital, whether it be philanthropic, government, foundations and what have you, that seek different outcomes, and not just on the finance. They prioritize different types of outcomes. So our fund, using blended finance, seeks to tap all these different types of pools of capital, because we need as much as we can get, to generate, one, an economic return and drive more capital and into the space, but also be able to then integrate the climate change mitigation, communities and livelihood outcomes, and biodiversity outcomes into the investment thesis at the beginning. And it allows us to then have, I guess for a better word, additionality, or how do we positively impact and target these with intentionality alongside the commercial return. And it's the proof of that model that then allows the asset class to develop and become more and more investable. And so there are two key themes behind the investment. One is wood. We produce timber, sustainably produced timber, and the tailwinds behind that is the world is always going to continue to use wood. It's directly correlated to GDP per capita, and more than half of the world's middle class currently reside in Asia. They're going to continue to use wood. In China, households use about 1/3 of the timber that US households use, so there's going to be an increasing demand, and that's got to come from somewhere. So sustainably managed timber plantations, where we get more product out of the same areas, will take the pressure off natural forest deforestation and conversion and other types of land use. And so wood as a renewable resource for plastics, and we talk about the land use transition, like people talk about the energy transition, and you know, it's about 1/4 of the 44 gigatons that the world emits. So 11.7, I think, is the number there. And that transition through conservation, better land management practices, and restoration is up to a quarter of that solution. So the land use sector has to go through the same thing. The other part of that now, the new tailwind, is the nature-based solution piece. Today, it's the most monetizable element of that is climate and the carbon credit. And so how we think about that is part of the investment thesis when we're identifying our ecosystems that we invest into and landscapes. But it also is just a single piece of that. And I'll talk about our mixed landscape approach in a second. But again, it is trying to get as much value from that land, that single piece of land, single hectare of land, as possible with more efficiency. So the more of that land you can use, the more it becomes valuable. And so traditionally it used to be just tree plantations. Today it's carbon finance. Tomorrow it's biodiversity. And then ultimately where we want to end up is having nature as an asset on a balance sheet. And I think that's the end use of that. It's like then you are truly valuing nature, and companies can then bring that onto their balance sheets, under all the reporting requirements. So TNFD, our funds are Article 9 SFDR, we're consistent with the EU taxonomy, and we report against all these things. So that is one of the tailwinds that we have in terms of being able to supply a solution to a lot of the corporate investors out there, and the disclosure requirements that they have in their investments.
A follow-up on some of the things you've commented on. So after investing in these nature-based solutions, how are they managed? How do you ensure longevity of these projects, and who manages them?
So again, we are looking at different types of structures. So in Asia, again, we are a 10-year closed-end fund, or there's a 10-year tenor. What we've done is we've innovated that. So our African fund is a permanent capital vehicle, long-term stewardship of the assets. But as we look at investment from an E&S perspective, we target 3 key sustainability themes. The first of those is that how does the investment contribute to the circular bioeconomy? And that is wood as a renewable product. And so that is one of the fundamental themes. The second is, how does this investment generate other types of impact outcomes in nature-based solutions, primarily around biodiversity, livelihoods, and climate again. And the third is, how can we share value, shared prosperity? And what that means is the stakeholders on the ground, so the local communities, are just as important as our investors at the other end of the spectrum, the funds that pensioners, school teachers, nurses, they invest. So they all rely on this investment for their livelihoods. So generating an economic return is fundamental, and economic sustainability is fundamental alongside those impact outcomes. So what we try and do is then, with the investment case, to show that the generation of positive impact outcomes is not necessarily mutually exclusive to the generation of economic returns. And I think this is something that you'll hear all the time, right? Impact costs money. And we're trying to show that it doesn't cost money because it either de-risks an asset and make it more investable, or something like a carbon credit is fundamentally more monetizable. So embedding that into the investment case makes it a very powerful proposition and creates that longevity, because any subsequent investors into that space looking to generate economic returns makes it then long-term. And by embedding the impact outcomes, then we've shown that it is an investable asset class. And one of the things in Asia is that it's, in terms of forestry and nature-based solutions, there's a very small asset class that we invest into, or can invest into, the addressable market. And what we're trying to do is show the model works. And if the model works, and we can make this a financial product, because ultimately you're competing against infrastructure and airports and toll roads and all sorts of other things, then we can scale this thing. And it's only through scaling with private capital that we're going to be able to achieve the outcomes that we need to, not just from a climate change mitigation point of view, but also those other types of impacts, including community, including biodiversity and other outcomes.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. With that, actually, I'd like to hear from our next speaker, Ms. Jennifer Lasimbang, giving a bit of a community perspective. So before we head into some questions and maybe some of your reactions to things that have been said, would like to introduce Jennifer. So Jennifer is a Kadazan and Orang Asal indigenous people of Malaysia from Sabah, Malaysia. In the last 30 years, she played diversified roles and supported various community-based programs and activities by local and international organizations, including UNDP and UNICEF, related to indigenous people's rights, and she's also focused on the area of indigenous people's education, socioeconomic benefits, and health issues, natural resource management, climate change, and cultural biodiversity. She is currently affiliated and working as the local and international officer of the Indigenous Peoples Network of Malaysia, a member organization of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. She is also a member of Sabah State Legislative Assembly and holds a portfolio as the assistant minister in the Ministry of Education and Innovation, Sabah. So please, Jennifer, if you could react to some of the comments, but also speak to your experience working with communities and other stakeholders.
Thank you, Sakina, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Just a slight correction on the not updated. I was a former assistant minister. Now I'm back and working together with the communities on the ground, with the Indigenous Peoples Network of Malaysia, and highlighting a lot of the things, the projects and the activities we are doing on the ground. And earlier on, our two speakers, Jeff has spoken about the respect and recognition of the local communities and indigenous peoples, and also Jeff and Jeffrey. Yeah, a lot of this also it's the global and not just local discussions with the indigenous people and how we'll be affected by coin term nature-based solution. And us as indigenous people, we have already a system that was practiced a long time ago, since time immemorial. Even before the nature-based solutions were coined, we're already living in harmony with nature. And now when these are being proposed, and we are part of the most, we are the ones who are suffering the most of the brunt of climate emergencies and climate change that's happening on the ground. And most of the time, one of our biggest challenge is actually to be recognized as people who have the solution at hand without monetizing what we already know and what we've been doing. Putting like carbon market and carbon credit is very expensive, and we don't have enough money to support those things. But at the same time, we are always excluded as indigenous people in terms of we have the solution, but we were not even given a seat sometimes at the discussion, and when things are happening in our territory because of the non-recognition of us as the people guarding the land, no secure tenureship on the territories that we have been protecting since we started living in that area. So what we want actually is we want to be part, we want to be engaged in terms of giving solutions to the climate emergency. So our panel, our keynote speaker talk about the situation at the moment is emergency. So most of us have experienced what is it like when we are in emergency situation. What happens? We reach out to everyone that we know. We look for any resources without looking at who is richer or is poorer, who is more able. Everybody come together during the time of emergency, and nobody is lesser or more than the other. So this is what we are trying to do or talk about in the space of the indigenous people's discussion. And of course, in the context of Asia, where we work together with all our partners, indigenous people in all the countries. And it's unfortunate that the states, some of the states in Asia do not recognize the legal, the name indigenous people even And it's really a struggle for us. But we are here, we are not playing victim during this climate emergency, but we are here offering us as your partner working on the ground, because sometimes the littlest investment that you give to indigenous people will come a long way, because we don't think that nature is monetized. We don't have money or value in terms of money on nature. Indigenous people are nature, and nature is indigenous people. So if you talk about nature-based solution, then it's indigenous people solution as well, that we have over the centuries have lived sustainably. We have the way of knowing that we are there to restore, nurture nature all the time, right? We are not there to when you have, we call it in Malay, you say pecah periuk. We don't break our own pot. Our nature, our background is our life. Yeah, so that's the perspective of indigenous people, and that's where we come from.
I have a question, a follow-up question. Are there any examples that you can draw on where various stakeholders have worked collaboratively with yourself and other indigenous communities to implement nature-based solutions?
Yeah, I think coming from Sabah, we are very lucky because we have also very good partners already. I'll just take an example of the Tagal system. It's a community-based resource management system, which has since become the Sabah Inland Fisheries enactment. So this Tagal system is basically how the indigenous people take care of the river and river resources. Tagal is literally translated as prohibition. So we have the red zone, we have the yellow zone, and have the green zone, where red zone is complete prohibition. And this is the breeding ground. So it's the indigenous way of knowing. You already know where the breeding grounds are and where it's safe to take fish when you need it, which is the yellow zone. And the green zone is where it's open for harvesting with the consensus of the community. Now, because of that, good partnership and good engagement with the Department of Fisheries in the state of Sabah, that we actually, in 2003, the Tagal system has been enacted as an enactment in the fisheries enactment. So right now we already have about 500 Tagal systems, over 200 rivers, in over 20 districts in the state of Sabah. And of course, there are challenges, knowing that when we implement something of a traditional or indigenous knowledge, some young people without the knowledge and the value that why it was there in the first place, we had an engagement with the young people, and they were not happy about this Tagal system. Why are you prohibiting us from simply taking the fish? This is, I have the right over the fish at the river behind my house. But then we have to go back and engage with the young people and say, Tagal system is not just prohibition from taking. It's also prohibition from you throwing your trash and whatnot into the river. So then the young people said, if you told me of this, then I will be fully supportive. So the continuous discussion and how this enactment came to place and how it will be sustainable and continue to be practiced from one generation to another. So we also have a lot of micro hydro, mini hydros, 5 kilowatts, 5 to 10 kilowatts in the off-grid communities, remote communities, where one of the biggest benefits is actually when we tell them very simply, if you take care of your water catchment, watershed, then you will have water, enough water to continuously generate your electricity. Then you have to forget about carrying on your back the fuel for your generators that is costing so much money to repair and maintain. And there's one of our first project in Sarawak where I could see the river was brown in the beginning of the project, and they didn't have a school. So the savings that came from the micro hydro that we built in over like just 5 years have been asking for school to be built in the community, and there were no peruntukan or budget. But because of the saving from the fuel and the maintenance of a generator in the village, 5 years down the road, the river was so clean, and the saving, they managed to build their own primary school. So these are the things that's already happening on the ground, and if only indigenous people are given space to tell and share our stories. We need support to show the visibility of what we are already doing on the ground, to tell our stories, to understand our worldview, and be part of the solution in this climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for offering the perspective of indigenous people. Moving on to our next panelist, Dr. Julian Pryor. He is the manager of the Grants and Partnerships team with the Global Evergreening Alliance. Dr. Pryor's team is responsible for designing large-scale land restoration, smallholder farmer livelihoods improvements, and carbon sequestration projects in the Asia-Pacific and Africa region. Previously, Dr. Pryor was a natural resources management specialist with the government in Australia, and a university academic for 20 years. He has acted as a natural resource management advisor and land use policy advisor for several governments in the Asia-Pacific and Africa region. Before we delve into questions, could you please describe the Global Evergreening Alliance and the different stakeholders that this alliance is comprised of?
Yeah, thank you, Sakina. The Global Evergreening Alliance is an alliance of NGOs, non-governmental organisations, and research organisations. So we have nearly 100 members now, and we act, I'm an employee of the Secretariat, and we design large-scale land restoration projects, particularly in degraded agricultural lands, but also working in forested lands as well. So our proposition is that through introducing sustainable agroforestry systems, we can enable smallholder landholders in developing countries to improve their livelihoods if we connect to markets. So our normal finance mechanism would traditionally be through the donors that Jeff mentioned before. But increasingly we're starting to work with the voluntary carbon market and access that climate finance.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Do you mind just expanding a bit on the role of voluntary carbon market in scaling up NBS and carbon sequestration in the Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, thank you. So it is an increasing role. A recent study by BCG found that the voluntary carbon market was worth $2 billion in 2021. That was a 4 times increase from the previous year. There have been a range of estimates of the growth of the voluntary carbon market, varying between $10 and $40 billion by 2030. So it's growing really rapidly. It's what we would call an immature market in many ways. There are a number of players. Obviously, we have investors, we have governments, we have our own members, the civil society members, we have communities, and they all have rather different interests and needs. So I think what we've found really interesting in working with all those stakeholders is trying to reconcile and build consensus and reach agreement over those varying needs.
Wonderful. I was wondering if you could also comment on how you engage with Indigenous communities in the work that you do, maybe commenting on some of what Jennifer has mentioned earlier.
Yes, I talk about a case study in the Philippines, a project we're currently designing. So my team, the Grants and Partnerships team, we designed the projects in collaboration with the investors, our members, and our implementing organisations. And I should point out, we normally work through a consortium of our members. There's a lead implementing organisation and 3 to 4 or more consortium members made up of often local NGOs. So in the Philippines, the investor is Moreover, which is a French-based investment platform. It's a $15 million US dollar project working in Mindanao and Luzon. The lead implementing organisation is Catholic Relief Services, working with ICRAF, the International Agroforestry Centre, and 2 local NGOs, YACAP in Luzon and the Philippine Eagle Foundation in Mindanao. So I just want to, there's a really nice story about the Philippine Eagle Foundation. So the Philippine eagle, I don't know how many people know of it. It's an iconic species in the Philippines, critically endangered. There are not many individuals or even breeding pairs left. It's featured on the Philippines currency as well. It needs an enormous amount of forest for breeding and survival. And the Philippine Eagle Foundation, which is broadly focused on biodiversity conservation but uses the Philippine eagle as an iconic species, works very closely with Indigenous communities. So the areas in which we're designing the project were quite dramatically logged 40 years ago through logging processes, deforestation. They're customary owned lands by Indigenous people. The Indigenous people have both spiritual and traditional beliefs around these lands, and the Philippine eagle as well. So the project is designing, I guess, two sets of interventions. One is reforestation in those customary lands using native species. The Philippine Eagle Foundation undertakes biodiversity surveys at the beginning of their projects and throughout the projects, and trains the community in setting up nurseries, native species nurseries, and re-establishing those habitats. And it's really interesting for me to see this, and when we talk to these Indigenous communities, this strong sense of intergenerational stewardship that comes through. And, you know, from an investor's point of view, these people are going to maintain those trees. I mean, the permanence aspect is established there. But we're also working, and Philippine Eagle Foundation is working on some of the adjacent lands, training the communities in developing agroforestry systems that will also provide livelihood and income. So it's a nice indication of how voluntary carbon market investment can achieve a number of things: land restoration, biodiversity conservation, improving the livelihoods of Indigenous communities, but also intergenerational stewardship as well.
Thank you so much. And based on your experience, what have been the biggest challenges of bringing various stakeholders together?
Yeah, I talk about each of the stakeholders individually because there are some differences. I think the challenge for the investors, and so I should point out the investors, some of the investors are, I'm thinking of examples that are directly going to offset. So we have investors that are voluntarily investing in carbon sequestration projects so they can account for their net zero race. Other investors are investment platforms like the Moreover example that I gave before. So I think one of the interesting things about the investors is that there's enormous diversity amongst them. So each investor is very different, you know, for many of our members who are used to dealing with donor organisations, which are more or less similar, investors are very diverse in terms of the needs, their interests. They're also, I think, for many investors, this is a new area of investment. So they're becoming used to the risks and uncertainties associated with sort of investment, sovereign risk, for example, but also quite excited around the opportunity to sequester carbon, to meet their ESG objectives and their corporate social responsibility objectives. So I think that example from Mindanao, Philippine Eagle Foundation, is a really good example of where an investor would be very happy with those sorts of outcomes. From the government's point of view, I think it's an enormous challenge from the policy perspective. You know, dealing with in many countries there is no regulation or policy to accommodate the voluntary carbon market. It's very much focused on the compliance market. Most of the governments we deal with have quite a bit of experience with REDD+, that Jeff Silver was talking about, but very little experience with tree planting and carbon removal projects of the nature we're talking about. So even the ministry that might deal with that is not clear. And I think this is, again, a perfect storm of policy for governments because climate change is a cross-sectoral issue, and which government agencies should lead is not always clear. So we're often dealing with ministries of agriculture, Ministry of Forestry, or departments of forestry, climate change ministries, who all have a stake in this, but with governments, it's always the lead ministry that is going to be important. And often, as they develop their regulatory frameworks, their approval frameworks, it's not clear as they work through this. So what I find interesting in our area is where, you know, many of the government agencies that we're working with, because we do design large-scale projects. For example, we've got a $150 million program in East and Southern Africa. Because we're an early adopter, governments have expressed an interest in working collaboratively with us to develop their frameworks and their policies, but it also means that there are long lead times. That's the uncertainty from the investor's point of view. It's not clear who's going to approve their project, particularly the carbon side, carbon aspect, and what the time frame might be. So this is an area of risk and uncertainty for investors. Civil society organisations, I think, again, this is new for them. The beauty of our model is we build on the technical expertise and the trust capital that has been built by, think of the NGOs that have been working for decades in a country. They can hit the ground running in terms of project design and implementation around agroforestry, land restoration, rural development, livelihoods projects. They know that stuff. But carbon's new for them. And this is a challenge for them. And we spend some time building capacity, the Alliance does, with our members around what a carbon project involves. We're talking about long-term projects, 30 to 40 years lifetime to achieve permanence. This is a much longer time frame that they're used to. Assessments such as additionality assessments, how to accommodate the international standards such as VERA and Gold Standard. These are very complex projects to design and implement, so everyone's learning at the same time. So I think the beauty is, and look, I've spent my career working in addressing land degradation, and finally we have the private sector involved in paying for ecosystem services. And this is something we need to nurture and manage really well. It's an enormous opportunity, but I think the big question is, how do we gather the lessons learned from this? Because there are a lot of individual activities taking place, and we, just sitting where we sit in GEA, we can see a lot of lessons being learned, but how do we aggregate those lessons learned amongst organisations and between stakeholders? Thanks.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker, Vivian Claire Liu, the founding Chief Executive Officer at Philanthropy Works, advises sovereign wealth funds and leading financial institutions at the cutting edge of optimizing climate alpha portfolio valuation. She leads Philanthropy Works in advising governments and business families, both optimizing and evaluating results in sustainable development and transformative philanthropy. So the question I have for you, Vivian, for today, what qualities should NBS demonstrate to be deemed high quality and investable?
Thank you. And I appreciate the sharing by my fellow panelists, especially Jennifer's very heartfelt and heartwarming perspective from the Aboriginals, from the indigenous people. My apologies. I did come from a capital markets conference in Singapore this week, where we talked, amongst other things, about climate smart investing from the perspective of family offices, as well as significant institutional investors, including sovereign wealth funds. So this is a key topic, and I look forward to a good discussion where we can not just exchange views, but hopefully advance both understanding and the actual state of play to advance nature-based solutions. Right? That's how we address the climate crisis at scale. So to be investable, obviously there are standards like additionality and permanence, and it's important to have this front and center. So what are the measures in any proposed project? How will they be monitored, to earlier points? And also, I think how funds or projects by those project managers have performed before. The track record does matter. So I think my fellow panelists have laid a great case for NBS. There hasn't been any comment, and I noticed that you mentioned VERA and Gold Standard. You have not mentioned South Pole. I don't know whether it's because of that project, which they have washed their hands of, right? So I think we need to both recognize the good and the bad, in order to move forward with transparency and with confidence. So integrity is obviously key, and I think it's clearly a problem that only 10% of existing carbon credits in the world are deemed, and this is an estimate, not all necessary information is really out there. So, but based on what we have, apparently only 10% meet ICVCM standards. What confidence should we draw from that? How should we invest in that? Right? So, if I could draw an analogy to the debt capital markets. So in the bond markets, there are different ratings based on, cash flows, the quality of the projects, and also sometimes who underwrites them, right? So you've all the way from AAA to junk. Junk, as the name would suggest, those are risky assets. So you don't really know whether you'll get your money back, etc. I'm vastly oversimplifying it, but if you'll bear with me, I think that going forward, we'll see not just a bifurcation in the carbon credit market, and obviously this has significant implications for NBS, but it will help, improve the clarity, and I think it will also reward the high quality managers who ensure that projects are well carried out, well monitored, and not just at the start, but obviously going forward, because how do you ensure that you meet the standards of permanence, regardless of the varying jurisdictional standards for permanence, right? So those are key, and in any sort of transaction, especially something that is so long duration, we need to know that we are working with people that we can trust. So that's important. So trusting them, getting a very good sense of the amount of carbon sequestered, the type of carbon, the type of climate, I would suggest. I think that has not come up as well. So yes, I would agree that Southeast Asia has great potential. I certainly, look, my background includes not just M&A at Goldman, but I also served with Doctors Without Borders in Liberia as a financial controller. I was at the World Bank in my first job, in the aftermath of the Asia financial crisis. So I do care a lot about people. I mean, to be serving with Doctors Without Borders, I think you can see what's going on in Israel, Gaza right now. Our people are there. So one, I certainly care, and I do understand the constraints and also the incentives of different sectors. So we have to ensure that everything is harnessed and aligned so that we have the best quality projects possible. I think, with the spotlight on carbon credits, on nature-based solutions, in the first wave, I think the people who have been engaged in this are people who genuinely care about the climate, about the people, and projects have moved forward on that front, given those values, right? In this wave, we have more people coming in, which is good, because we need more resources, human capital and financial capital and other sorts of capital, right? In this group, however, there are people who, frankly, only care about money. You know it. So when one only cares about money and does not care about the climate, the people, the forest, all these are just tools for them to make money, and they really don't care. So we run the risk, therefore, of tarnishing the good that nature-based solutions can do, both on the carbon sequestration front, which is obviously critical, and for indigenous rights and all, right? biodiversity, which we have touched on, also absolutely important. I think we're still, you know, I think TFND and all, I think we still need clarity on the optimal ways to assess the amount of both carbon and biodiversity that have been, you know, preserved or that can be enhanced going forward. So those are key. Those are drivers of valuation, right? So we need clarity, we need trust, we need, you know, high integrity people to have high integrity projects. Now regulations have a key role to play, both in providing increasing demand from, you know, might be institutional investors, it could be, you know, corporations. So Singapore's, you know, carbon tax laws now allow for companies to offset 5%, just 5%, of their carbon emissions via carbon credits in selected countries that, you know, the government has basically made agreements with. So that's something that the Trade Ministry folks have been very, you know, busy with. So that's to ensure that we have a certain level of sovereign, you could say trust, but well, if your assets are in another country, obviously you are dependent on that country's government, which may or may not change every 4 years, 5 years, or in between and whatnot. So you need to know that your investments are secure. That's certainly a risk that of NBS assets that I think has been touched on a little earlier. So clarity on all this would be critical going forward. If you want to optimize the scale of the markets and to, you know, optimize not just the scale but the value so that all the stakeholders can be appropriately rewarded and, you know, then incentivize more people to come in.
Thank you so much. I would like to offer the panelists to react to any of the comments that Vivian has mentioned or to add some more flavor to some of her comments and feedback.
And I think a lot of what you said really resonates with us. But in terms of scaling the market, what we do need is consistent standards and regulation. And unfortunately, the people that don't care, we need them too. We need everybody to do this if we're going to solve the climate change crisis. Yeah. And the way that and I note this morning, I think the Standing Committee for Article 6.4 just made recommendations just in time for COP for 6.4 credits, which is part of what I think should be the standardization. But I mean, the way to scale this is to make it, align it with all the different stakeholders. So that's the first thing. But also we do need the development, just like you see bond markets and the capital markets with hedging mechanisms, long-term curves and all sorts of different things. The carbon markets need to reflect that. And the more players you have, whether they be financial players, whether they be nature-based players or investment managers or even the end users of carbon offsets, need to participate, because then you get an efficient market regime. And so even today you see, in terms of carbon offsets, you've got CORSIA eligible tokens, you've got all sorts of different nature-based carbon offsets and what have you. The market is already determining which of these projects have high integrity. And you know, you can buy a carbon credit for 30 cents or 40 cents, all the way up to $25 for blue carbon type projects. And what's happening now is, without that standardization, what you're getting is aesthetic carbon. So yes, growing mangroves has benefits, but it's still the same ton of carbon as I take out of the atmosphere by growing a forest. And with that standardization is where you'll start to get volume. And so instead of saying aesthetic carbon, and I can say, you know, I've restored a mangrove ecosystem, and I put that on my, you know, annual report, it's more about how do I trade billions and billions and billions of tons. So we need those financial market mechanisms to be able to do that. And the way we achieve that is to make it economically sustainable, to align it with everybody's interest. And unfortunately, the people that just want to make money are an important part of that ecosystem as well, because they create the market. And without that, it's a bilateral process at the moment. So without standardization and regulation, and governments need to recognize this, and the role of private sector to help governments meet their NDCs, it's not going to happen. And we bump up against this all the time. It's not about individual projects. It's about establishing a very liquid, solid market with standardization. And in bond markets, it's MAS or other regulatory bodies. We need that here. And I think if we go down the route of 6.4 at COP, that's a big step towards getting this thing right. And so, yeah, again, to really scale this, we don't want to be talking about billions. We want to be talking about trillions. And that's how we need to think. We need to have that ambition, because if we don't, we're never going to get there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so like I said, we do need more, human and all sorts of capital to scale nature-based solutions. So yes, even people who are just in it for the money, they are a useful part of the solution if well regulated and well managed. That's an important if, right? So I think that, I don't know whether, is there anyone from South Pole here? To have a signature project that you then walk away from, I don't know what happens to, well, the trees, the indigenous people there, the community benefits that were promised, and their poor clients. My goodness, how could that possibly be allowed to happen? South Pole is not small. In fact, it's a unicorn, right? So for that just beggars belief, but it's there, and I think that questions are justified.
Thank you so much. Yes, Jeff.
No, thank you so much for the perspective. It's definitely been the elephant in the room during this conversation. Criticisms that we are getting towards the BCM, concerns about integrity, et cetera. I think it's really important to recognize that standards that have been flagged as key for integrity, with rules that are science-based and transparent, doesn't on their own protect from projects going wrong, things being mistakes. I think also the recognition that these are science-based standards. They're not static. They're meant to improve. We're meant to find issues and build upon them. The sector is so nascent, it's so new, that we're just learning how to have broader participation in these, to hold these projects to be accountable. So having that oversight is really important, and it's key. Having been in the sector for a long time, I've seen perspective up and down. I can't tell you how many times I've heard REDD+ is dead, but here we are pushing on. These are not people after money in general. In the conservation sector, we're people who are traditionally very low paid under very stressful environments. I myself know people who've been run down, shot, and killed because of their belief in protecting the environment, working on these projects that need the finance that this climate finance opportunity provides. And you mentioned trust, and then you cite that study, the 10%, only 10% of these projects are not hot air. That's one study backed by one lab in Berkeley using, a statistical analysis of synthetic control, whatever, blah, 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 technical stuff. But it's been broadcast by The Guardian through the media attacking a complex system that's hard to understand and undermining confidence and trust. And you reflected those numbers as if that was the data or the science, but that's one paper. So it's really a messaging thing. So being willing to be transparent, to say we're wrong, collectively, globally, we're failing at this. We're desperate. So, it's also bringing up like the South Pole example and a project that, corruption or whatever the issues were, it wasn't working and allowed to proceed is, how does that happen? And it is because it is nascent and we are growing and bias does get into these systems. But they are designed for participatory approaches. They're designed to grow, to improve. They're designed to support people who are dedicated and passionate about their work to have sustained, permanent change in the landscapes, supporting communities. Now, the Scene Coalition that I'm a part of, which are member base of different conservation organizations regionally, this is why we're in the sector of carbon credits, because it's a key finance source. Clearly, lots of problems, things that we're not doing right, things that can be improved, but we're working on it. We're dedicated to achieving these outcomes that we all want. So I think it's that oversight, criticism, advocacy, those are all vital. And as a bit of an anecdote, I think about 8 years ago, there was a anti-RED person, Chris Lang. He had an anti-RED blog online. I assume it's still there. And I was working on carbon development at the early level, and I get so angry at these articles he wrote. It's like, you don't understand what we're doing. You're taking a piece out of context and you're attacking it and you're trying to tear down a whole structure. But then a guy I worked with, he said, well, no, let's respond to that. Let's create a dialogue and a conversation about that. And so instead of boom, 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 being angry, we really worked on communicating what we're doing, how we saw what we're doing, what we heard he was saying, and we responded. And he was positive. Didn't change anything, but it created a positive dialogue. So criticism is good. It's necessary. It's necessary for science continually to evolve. Broader participation is essential for this to be successful. So the media, concerns, all this is positive. The story is going out there. But we can't let it destroy something that has decades of work and a base that would be incredibly difficult to recreate in another way to make impacts in nature and nature-based solutions. So I really strongly want to encourage a more positive messaging at the potential, the process, and acknowledgement of problems within the system can happen. There will be more bad stories, but an acknowledgement that we are iteratively and progressively fixing and working on that, and the people doing that are dedicated to that. Now, essentially, we are tying to markets, and what you're describing is a culture clash. And how to take something as messy and as messy as conservation on the ground, people, communities, relationships, and how to tie that into the language of finance. So I've been in Singapore 2 years. I'm having these conversations. I'm having to pretend I understand the language of finance. And I'm looking out the side of my eye with the investment people I'm with, like, do I make sense? And it's tough, because we're translating something messy to a system that does not and cannot handle too much risk, particularly as we see interest rates going up, money's getting more expensive, decisions to make risky investments are getting harder to make. So how we communicate this complex, messy system that's critical and important and absolutely must be tied to these economic systems for us to change the behavior that we're seeing on the ground, we have to work on the messaging and the communication in a way that acknowledges these different areas, but really understands the goal and holds the accountability of the overall process first and foremost.
Thank you so much, Jeff. think you wanted to make some comments.
Thank you for that. Jeff also puts a perspective on how we are dealing with the climate conversation in the indigenous people spaces. Even as science, you get frustrated because it's a mainstream knowledge. You have reference books, you have a language, and you can communicate it. And imagine if that's the indigenous knowledge. And how do we communicate our way of knowing to the mainstream without being told you are outdated, why should we listen to you, you know, go back to your whatever. So as frustrating it is, as a former scientist, I agree with you how frustrating it is and easily twisted, but at the same time, we are 100 or 1,000 times more difficult for us to convey our stories, to convey our knowledge to the world that we do have solutions. And it's not a big money. If you just give us a space, for example, if there's money to buy the land adjacent to a community territory that has been degraded and invest a little bit on the community to restore and nurture that nature back to health, we can do that. You don't have to monitor us because it is what we want and it's what we're built for in the community. And you don't have to do monitoring and all that because we don't need to be paid to do that, actually. We just need some capacity to be able to tell you what's going on. What extra things we need to tell our stories, to amplify this, and to have more spaces for us to do that on the ground. Because we've worked with, say for example, we work with the wildlife department on when they were poaching in the indigenous territories and saying, you indigenous people, stop killing the animal. I said, well, that's not how we take things from nature. We only take what we need enough, and it's not to kill the whole species. It's enough for us, and we know where to get it, how we get it. There's no, that's why I said, even for science, it's difficult to explain, and we ourselves as indigenous persons, it's really, really difficult for us to tell the world, but please give us the trust, give us the resources to, for us to tell our stories, for us to do things on the ground that would really, really benefit the whole world. And then it's difficult, complex. Yes, we want capacity building. And my head is exploding the whole week understanding climate finance and carbon markets and all that. But how do we translate that to the communities to also be part of the conversation? And when carbon trading is happening or carbon credit is being discussed in the community, how do we explain it to the community so that we can get the free, prior, informed consent to say yes, consent to say no. Yeah, so we have to have, so that we are on the same page, because this is emergency. We don't get to choose who we work with, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. I empathize with, having to essentially drink at a fire hose of all that's relevant. I'm happy to offer a listening ear and to try and see how we can help. So, Jeff, I actually know several generations of your CI leaders in Singapore, APAC. So, great respect for the work that, respectable NGOs like yours have been doing in this regard. So you disputed the 10%. I'm not the only one who, refers to that 10%, but let's go there. Why not have each panelist share with us their views? Could be a number, could be a range. If they have a view, so you don't have to if you don't want to comment, but what is your view then, either personally or organizationally, on carbon credits that are high integrity? And I would actually be interested in, crowdsource intelligence. So for those who are in the audience, I'm curious also whether you have any comments as to the percentage of the carbon markets you have confidence in. And I mean, obviously, we don't represent, the world, right? Everyone here obviously cares about the climate or has an interest, both. But I think most people do care. So there would be a certain bias that way, I think. But shall we ask them first, or shall we do this first?
We can ask the audience and then start a round of questions. So,
Sure.
Yeah. Does anyone have any answers or contributions? Yeah. Okay.
I would just like to, I'm Zakir Ahmed Khan from Concerned Worldwide, Bangladesh. I would like to resonate with Jennifer, actually how much, with a very small contribution can bring a big change. I would like to share a story that I have shared some other day. In Bangladesh, there is an area which is in tectonically depressed area. It remained half of the year under the water, and half of the year it turns to a vast paddy field and producing 45% of paddy of the country. In that area, 30 years back, we have supported communities to have roadside tree plantation, and at that time we have planted over 300,000 trees. And 2 years back, we had a very big flood over there, and which is worse than 100 years that the people have experienced. Then from our organization, we have sent out to that area where those trees are still active, still alive or active kind of thing. We have found after 30 years, those out of 300,000, over 150,000 trees are still alive, very big and strong, and they have contributed a lot to have, to minimize the negative effect of the floods. So for example, keeping all the roads as intact, for example, and apart from other, climate related to climate benefit kind of thing. And what we have seen, that because of being those trees still alive, we have put the community people into the central part of the process of designing the program. They were engaged in the process, and a futuristic profit, ownership was profit sharing part was calculated over there, and government was engaged in the whole process when engaging the design the program. And after 30 years, those trees values more than 150 million US dollars. But investment was a few $100,000 kind of thing. So that's what, if we can support the indigenous communities and the rural communities with a very minimal level of support and having a very good partnership and engagement with the local government and the whole process, and we can show them the benefit in terms of economic benefit comes first for the community people, those who are extremely poor. So at least if we don't make them understand all these climatic values kind of thing, but if they realize that this is their future and this can bring a very big benefit to them, and with a very small level of investment, we can make a big difference, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for providing the example of how to bring local communities with small investments with big returns. Any other questions or comments on Vivian's previous question? Francis?
Hi, so Francis from the Climate Champions team. Can you hear me? Just check it's on. Actually, as I was watching this panel, I was reminded of something one of our colleagues said that they heard from MENA Regional Climate Week, which was that when you're on a panel in a discussion, it's not about whether your argument is right or whether somebody else's argument is right. It's about getting the argument right together. And I think this is a real case with the nature-based solutions, the carbon credits. A lot of people have had experience where things haven't worked before, and almost feel sort of, we've tried this, it doesn't work, whether it's integrity of credits, whether it's, the concerns about offsetting. But we do know that we have to get this money into preserving these ecosystems and the biodiversity. So I think we just have to make it work. And so it's not really about sort of do we give up because it's been proven to have issues. It's about how do we learn from every single aspect that doesn't work, but acknowledge it hasn't worked, and then work out how to improve it going forward. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you so much. Kapil?
Thanks. This was a very interesting panel, and I noticed two ends of the spectrum. One, the financial markets, which they are based on the premise that you can monetize nature. And what we heard from Jennifer was that they don't want to go on that end. It's complex, it's not understood, it's very new. So my question is that markets work under certain presumptions, and we've seen them fail over time and again. Can we have some solutions which the people want? Why don't we hear them? What are the solutions? Do we really want to go to the end of, monetizing nature itself? Why can't we make things work without that?
Look, I think when you talk about polar opposites, the way we see it is just, it's part of a single ecosystem, right? I think Jennifer talked about free, prior, and informed consent. That social license to operate is the fundamental principle of everything we invest into. So as a practitioner and an investor in that space, FPIC, IFC performance standards, indigenous populations, Forest Stewardship Council, FSC certification, that underpins our ENS policy. But it doesn't have to be complicated. And so I'll give you an example. In Laos, we have community forestry programs whereby we share our trees and allow communities to grow trees on their own. And then when it's grown, they have the opportunity to sell it to us first. If they don't like the price, they can sell it to anyone else in the market. So it's part of that community engagement, social license to operate, and what have you. But when we're talking and talking to the communities around FPIC, we have social teams in all our assets. We have ENS and social managers embedded in the funds itself. And it's a constant FPIC process. So anytime we want to do activities in any certain area, we have community teams that go out and meet the local community. And even in meeting the communities, we ensure that at least 50% of 80% of the community needs to turn up, but at least 50% of those are women, for instance. And when we first started in Laos, we actually separated the men and the women to talk to the women separately so they wouldn't be intimidated. And that constant information flow. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be transparent. Yeah, sorry. It just has to be transparent. Now, unfortunately, because you're driving finance into these areas, you need to have integrity of the product. And monitoring is a key part of that. Monitoring, verification, and reporting. Because without that, then you don't have a product that people can rely on. And it doesn't have to be intrusive. It just needs to ensure that there's integrity behind that carbon offset or that biodiversity or whatever I'm reporting to you on. And so we don't want to be intrusive. We want to tell the communities what we're doing, because ultimately we want to be including them, and things like capacity building, skill transfer, local employment, all that stuff is embedded into the business case. And ultimately, we would like to have members of the local communities running our projects on the ground. Because that's what it's going to take. They know it better than anyone else. And that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Jeff. Would you like to make some last remarks?
Of course, thank you, Jeff. And of course, it's a good conversation, and appreciate that, we operate differently, but we have a space to be able to speak that out. We understand each other and bring this information back in the community, that you understand the concepts and fundamentals of FPIC when you are doing the project. And for the community also, at the same time, have a little capacity in terms of understanding what's going on, what is the market about, why are we monetizing, there's a possibility that we can say no, right? So, that's the conversation that we're having, and I think if we can have more of this conversation with the community at every country, for example, the government should be able to regulate these processes and facilitate it.
Just one last thing. So I also sit on the board of RECOF, which is a community-based forestry for livelihoods based out of Thailand. And again, community-based projects, developing engagement models and things. We're developing those things to be able to then take to private sector or other investors to be able to then roll this out at scale.
So I think to bridge that and also to bring the discussion to a close, given the time, there are different tranches of capital. There is pure philanthropy, there's impact capital. I think when you go to the markets with impact capital and market-priced funds, it would be probably impossible to avoid monitoring because that's how investors and managers gain comfort. For philanthropic capital, it may be possible, but usually people do want impact. So nature-based solutions, I think we are all for it. I tend to explore all sides, and I tend to speak to what I think or what I know is critical but wasn't covered, right? So I'm certainly an ally in this, and I certainly want to advance nature-based solutions to meet the needs of our planet. So we're not giving up. And yes, it is crucial to learn. It is crucial to figure out what the best practices are so that we can scale. I'm not, I think there are many approaches, many results, and there are indeed ways to assess the quality of them. We might not all agree, but one example is at the World Bank in '98, we launched this governance at a glance thing, assessing governance across countries. Can you imagine how politically sensitive that was? There were certain countries that are, really significant that didn't like that, wanted to veto it, and 2 decades on, that has gained currency. So it's not perfect, but there are indeed ways to assess governance in legal reform, civil service performance, etc., right? So learning, assessments, and drawing out best practices will be important. I don't think that we can pretend that it's, all good. I noticed that no one really wanted to, comment on the percentage of carbon markets. I think that says a fair bit. So I'm not going to push. I'm happy to, my door is open not just to Jennifer, but to anyone who wants to, offer evidence-based views. And yeah, let's work together to advance nature-based solutions.
Thank you so much, Vivian. So thank you for attending today's session, and we've heard various perspectives from the panelists here. So what I would like to offer is a bit of hope that nature-based solutions will hopefully be scaled up, that the benefits would be realized, and we can have a benefit case that many people can rally behind. So thank you today for joining, and a round of applause for the panelists today.
You're the stars of the show.
So thank you so much for the opportunity and for us. I'll have to give you my.
I was just going to say, one of the
I am asked to because I have another hat that was direct access to funding. One of the board members of the NBS Foundation. Asia Solidarity Fund. Okay. So I mean, I kind of feel that. Have you met Razan? We had I was in New York for the climate week. Okay. So we met her. She's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big focus for her this year is ensuring that the indigenous people can
but there's also the issue you mentioned, carbon is 30 plus deforestation, so we need to get our analysis much clearer about what the policies because there is an issue with the global standard, but there's separate issues. That's what doesn't mean. Standards are being criticised, and that's a 10% and that's around it. We don't know about it, so we just want to so just distinguishing around what the criticisms are and what needs to change, I think is really important. So do you understand what I'm making about red plus and avoiding deforestation? So essentially the criticism is the additionality assessment. Okay, so there's methodology, there's work, that's a criticism. Our polls are project many project programs, and I think this issue of high integrity carbon is a really critical issue.